In the final desperate years of World War II, as Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble and Soviet armies pushed relentlessly westward, Adolf Hitler became obsessed with a wonder weapon that he believed would turn the tide of war. The Vergeltungswaffe II, or Vengeance Weapon II, known simply as the V-2, was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a technological marvel that represented a quantum leap in military engineering. Standing 46 feet tall and capable of reaching speeds over 3,500 miles per hour, the V-2 could strike targets over 200 miles away with no warning and no defense. It was a weapon from the future, arriving in the midst of a war still largely fought with weapons conceived in the previous generation. Hitler poured enormous resources into the V-2 program, spending approximately $3 billion in today's money, consuming precious materials, fuel, and industrial capacity that Germany desperately needed for conventional weapons. Over 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp, killing approximately 7,000 people. But the cost of this technological achievement was paid not just in money and resources, but in human lives. The hellish conditions in which the V-2 rockets were manufactured, using slave labor drawn from concentration camps, resulted in the deaths of more people building the rockets than were killed by the rockets themselves. An estimated 12,000 to 20,000 forced laborers died during the construction of V-2 rockets, worked to death, starved, beaten, or executed in underground factories that resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno. The V-2 program stands as one of the most grotesque examples of Nazi brutality, combined with strategic stupidity. A wonder weapon that consumed vast resources, achieved negligible military results, and killed more of its builders than its intended victims. The origins of the V-2 rocket lay not in military ambitions, but in the dreams of space enthusiasts and rocket pioneers. In the 1920s and early 1930s, amateur rocket societies in Germany experimented with liquid-fueled rockets, inspired by the theoretical work of pioneers like Hermann Oberth and the writings of science fiction authors who imagined space travel. Among these enthusiasts was a young engineer named Werner von Braun, who joined the German Rocket Society and began conducting experiments with liquid propellant engines. The German military took notice of this work, seeing potential military applications for rocket technology. In 1932, the German army established a rocket research program and recruited von Braun and other talented engineers. Throughout the 1930s, working at a secret facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, von Braun and his team developed increasingly sophisticated rockets. Their goal was to create a long-range ballistic missile that could deliver a warhead to distant targets, bypassing traditional air defenses. The technical challenges were enormous. The rocket needed powerful engines that could lift a heavy payload, a guidance system to aim it accurately, a structure that could withstand the stresses of launch and flight, and the ability to survive re-entry into the atmosphere. Von Braun's team solved these problems one by one through years of painstaking research and countless test failures. By 1942, the basic design of what would become the V-2 was established. The rocket used liquid oxygen and ethanol as propellants, burned in a sophisticated engine that produced 56,000 pounds of thrust. It was guided by an inertial navigation system using gyroscopes and accelerometers, primitive by modern standards but cutting edge for the time. The warhead carried approximately 1 ton of explosives, a relatively small payload given the rocket's size and complexity. On October 3, 1942, the first successful V-2 test flight was conducted. The rocket flew 118 miles and reached an altitude of 53 miles, becoming the first human-made object to reach the edge of space. It was a historic achievement, a demonstration that ballistic missiles were feasible, that humanity could build vehicles capable of reaching beyond the atmosphere. Von Braun and his colleagues celebrated, envisioning a future of space exploration and interplanetary travel. Hitler and the Nazi leadership saw something different. They saw a weapon of terror and revenge. Hitler had initially been skeptical of the rocket program, viewing it as too futuristic and too far from practical application. But as the war turned against Germany, as the certainty of victory transformed into the desperate struggle for survival, Hitler became increasingly obsessed with miracle weapons that could reverse Germany's fortunes. The V-2 became his favorite wonder weapon, the technological trump card that would shock the Allies into surrender. He ordered the program accelerated and expanded, demanding mass production of thousands of rockets. This decision, made in 1943, committed Germany to a massive investment in a weapon system that had never been proven in combat, that suffered from numerous technical problems, and that required resources Germany could not spare. The resources consumed by the V-2 program were staggering. Each rocket required approximately 30 tons of potatoes to produce the ethanol fuel. In a Germany where food was already scarce and the civilian population faced rationing and hunger, diverting food production to rocket fuel was a grotesque misallocation. The rockets required high-grade steel, aluminum, copper, and other materials that were desperately needed for tanks, aircraft, and other weapons. They required precision manufacturing and skilled labor that could have been employed building fighters to defend German cities from Allied bombers. The total cost of the V-2 program has been estimated at approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks, equivalent to about $3 billion in modern currency when adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. To put this in perspective, this was more than the United States spent on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. Germany invested more in building V-2 rockets than America invested in building the weapon that would end the war and usher in the nuclear age. The comparison is instructive. The atomic bomb required immense scientific and industrial resources, but produced a weapon that forced Japan to surrender and established American dominance in the post-war world. The V-2 required comparable resources, but produced a weapon that had virtually no impact on the war's outcome. The decision to mass-produce the V-2 required building new manufacturing facilities on a massive scale. The existing development facility at Peenemünde was vulnerable to Allied bombing and lacked the capacity for mass production. The Nazi regime decided to build an enormous underground factory complex that would be immune to air attack. The site chosen was near Nordhausen in central Germany, in the southern Harz Mountains. Here tunnels were carved into a mountain to create a vast subterranean factory complex code named Mittelwerk, or Central Works. The tunnels extended for miles through solid rock, creating 2 parallel main galleries connected by dozens of side tunnels. The excavation and construction of this underground city was itself a massive undertaking that consumed enormous resources and time. But the cost in human terms was far more terrible than the cost in money or materials. The labor force for building the tunnels and manufacturing the rockets came from concentration camp prisoners. The SS established a special camp called Mittelbau-Dora to supply workers for the underground factory. Prisoners were brought from other camps across the Nazi system, selected because they had technical skills or simply because they were available. The conditions in the tunnels were among the worst in the entire concentration camp system, which is saying something given the systematic brutality that characterized all Nazi camps. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in the cold, damp tunnels, breathing air thick with rock dust and chemical fumes. There was no ventilation in the early stages of construction, no sanitation facilities, no adequate shelter. Prisoners slept on the bare rock floor of the tunnels, without blankets, without heat, crowded together in conditions that bred disease. Food rations were starvation level, barely enough to keep prisoners alive, let alone sustain them through hard physical labor. Guards and capos, prisoner functionaries given authority over other prisoners, enforced discipline with savage beatings and arbitrary executions. Anyone who collapsed from exhaustion, who failed to work fast enough, who showed any sign of weakness, was beaten or killed. Hangings were conducted regularly in the tunnels as examples to terrify the other prisoners into compliance. The work itself was brutal and dangerous. Prisoners excavated the tunnels using hand tools and explosives, breathing rock dust that caused respiratory diseases. They hauled heavy materials through the tunnels. They assembled the rockets from components, working with toxic chemicals and propellants without adequate protection. The assembly work required precision, and mistakes were punished with beatings or death. The SS guards and civilian managers treated the prisoners as expendable resources, literally working them to death and replacing them with new prisoners when they died. The death rate in the tunnels was extraordinary, even by the grim standards of the Nazi camp system. Prisoners died from starvation, disease, exhaustion, beatings, and outright murder. Those who became too weak to work were either killed on the spot or sent back to other camps to die. The exact number of people who died building V-2 rockets is difficult to establish with precision because Nazi record-keeping was incomplete and many records were destroyed as the regime collapsed. However, historians have reconstructed estimates based on surviving documents, testimony from survivors, and analysis of the camp population. The consensus estimate is that between 12,000 and 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelbau-Dora and associated camps during the construction of the tunnels and the production of V-2 rockets. Some estimates run even higher. What is certain is that more people died building the V-2 than were killed by V-2 attacks. The rocket, designed as a weapon of vengeance, killed more of its slaves than its enemies. The first operational V-2 attacks were launched in September 1944. Almost 2 years after Hitler had ordered mass production. The delay reflected the immense technical and logistical challenges of the program. Early production rockets were plagued with reliability problems. Many exploded on launch or shortly after. Others veered off course and crashed. The guidance systems were imprecise, making accurate targeting impossible. A V-2 aimed at London might land anywhere within a circle several miles in diameter. There was no way to correct course once the rocket was launched, no way to assess whether it had hit its target, no way to learn from mistakes and improve accuracy. The rockets were simply fired in the general direction of the target with the hope that they would land somewhere nearby and cause damage. Despite these limitations, the V-2 attacks caused real terror and real casualties in London and other targeted cities. The rockets arrived without warning, traveling faster than sound, so the explosion was the first indication of attack. There was no air raid siren, no time to take shelter, no defense. You were simply going about your business when suddenly a building exploded and collapsed. The psychological impact was significant, creating anxiety and fear among civilian populations that had already endured years of war. The most devastating single V-2 attack occurred on November 25, 1944, when a rocket struck a Woolworths department store in New Cross. London, killing 168 people. Other attacks killed dozens at a time. Over the course of the campaign from September 1944 to March 1945, approximately 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched, with about 1,400 hitting London and surrounding areas, and another 1,600 targeting the Belgian port city of Antwerp, which the Allies were using as a major supply hub. The total death toll from V-2 attacks was approximately 7,000 people, with thousands more injured. These casualties were tragic, but they represented a minuscule impact on the Allied war effort. The V-2 attacks did not disrupt industrial production, did not prevent military operations, did not break civilian morale, and did not change the strategic situation in any meaningful way. The Allies barely diverted resources to defend against the V-2 because there was no effective defense. You could not shoot down a supersonic ballistic missile with the technology available in 1944. The only counter was to overrun the launch sites and capture the production facilities, which the Allies were already doing as part of their general advance into Germany. From a military perspective, the V-2 was a complete failure. It consumed enormous resources and produced negligible results. The question that must be asked is, what Germany could have accomplished with the resources squandered on the V-2 program. The $3 billion spent on the V-2 could have produced approximately 24,000 fighter aircraft. Germany was desperately short of fighters in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bomber formations darkened the skies over German cities. Additional fighters could have inflicted far more casualties on Allied bombers, potentially disrupting the strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German industry. The resources could have produced thousands of additional tanks at a time when German armored units were being ground down on both fronts. They could have produced millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of artillery pieces, fuel for existing vehicles that were sitting idle for lack of gasoline. Any conventional application of these resources would have been more militarily effective than the V-2 program. Some historians have argued that the real value of the V-2 program was not military but technological, that it advanced rocket science and laid the foundation for the space age. This argument has merit. The V-2 was indeed a revolutionary technological achievement. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union captured V-2 rockets, documents, and engineers, including Wernher von Braun himself, who went on to lead the American space program. The V-2 technology directly influenced the development of post-war ballistic missiles and space launch vehicles. The Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon was designed by von Braun and his team using knowledge gained from the V-2 program. In this sense, the V-2 did change history, just not in the way Hitler intended. But this historical irony provides no justification for the program from Germany's wartime perspective. Germany needed weapons that would help it win the war in 1944 and 1945, not technology that would enable space exploration decades later. The human cost of the V-2 program extended beyond the slave laborers who died building the rockets. The program diverted resources from other military needs, potentially prolonging the war and increasing casualties on all sides. German soldiers fighting on the eastern and western fronts lacked equipment and support that might have been available if resources had not been poured into the V-2. Civilians in German cities died under Allied bombing that might have been less severe if Germany had built fighters instead of rockets. The entire program represented a colossal misallocation of scarce resources by a regime that was losing the war and grasping at technological fantasies instead of facing reality. Wernher von Braun's personal responsibility for the use of slave labor in V-2 production remains controversial. After the war, von Braun was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, the American program to capture German scientists and engineers. He became the face of the American space program, a hero who led the effort to land humans on the moon. His role in the Nazi war machine and the use of slave labor was downplayed or ignored during his lifetime. However, historical evidence clearly shows that von Braun knew about the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora. He visited the factory, he saw the prisoners, and he understood that slave labor was being used to build his rockets. Whether he personally ordered or participated in the abuse of prisoners is unclear, but he benefited from their forced labor and did nothing to stop it. After the war, he expressed no remorse for the prisoners who died, focusing instead on his pride in the technological achievement of the V-2 and his excitement about the future of space exploration. This moral blindness, this ability to separate the scientific achievement from the human cost, is deeply troubling and raises difficult questions about the ethics of scientific progress achieved through atrocity. The V-2 program also illustrates the fundamental irrationality of Nazi decision-making in the final years of the war. As Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, Hitler and the Nazi leadership became more detached from reality, more willing to believe in miracle weapons and fantasy solutions, less willing to face the hard truth that Germany was losing and that no wonder weapon could reverse the outcome. Resources were poured into projects like the V-2, the V-1 flying bomb, jet fighters, and other advanced weapons that were technologically impressive but strategically irrelevant. Meanwhile, basic needs like fuel, ammunition, and spare parts went unmet. The German economy was being bled dry by an irrational war machine that consumed everything and produced nothing of strategic value. The Allied advance into Germany in 1945 eventually overran the V-2 launch sites and production facilities. The last V-2 attacks occurred in March 1945, and by April, Allied forces had captured the underground factories at Nordhausen. What they found shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. The tunnels were filled with partially assembled rockets, components, and the evidence of the horrors that had occurred there. Survivors, emaciated and sick, told their stories of the brutal conditions and the thousands who had died. The liberating troops documented what they found, though the full extent of the atrocities would only become clear later as historians pieced together the story from documents and testimony. In the final accounting, the V-2 program stands as a monument to the futility of technological sophistication, divorced from strategic sense and moral restraint. It was a weapon born from the dreams of visionary engineers, corrupted by Nazi ideology, built through slave labor and mass murder, deployed too late and in too small numbers to affect the war's outcome, and consuming resources that could have been far better employed. The 12,000 to 20,000 prisoners who died building the rockets, working in conditions of unimaginable brutality, paid the highest price for Hitler's obsession with vengeance weapons. Their deaths, along with the billions of dollars wasted and the opportunities foregone, represent one of the most grotesque examples of strategic incompetence and moral bankruptcy in military history. Hitler believed the vengeance against the Allies who were destroying his regime. Instead, it became a symbol of the regime's depravity, a wonder weapon that killed more of its makers than its targets, a technological marvel that hastened rather than delayed Germany's defeat. The lesson is clear and enduring. Weapons, no matter how advanced, cannot compensate for flawed strategy, and technological achievement means nothing when built on a foundation of slavery and murder. The V-2 reached the edge of space, but it was created in a hell on Earth, and that hell consumed more lives than the rocket ever claimed in combat.